There is a conversation that millions of Christians have been quietly carrying for years, sometimes in the back of their minds during a Sunday sermon, sometimes in the silence of a sleepless night, sometimes in a moment of unusually honest prayer, when they finally feel brave enough to let the question rise to the surface. It is a conversation about freedom, about rules, about the painful and persistent gap between what God actually said and what religious tradition has layered on top of his words across the centuries. And it is a conversation that, frankly, the church has not always been willing to have openly, honestly, or without defensiveness. You may have felt it yourself, that quiet, unresolved tension between your genuine love for God and a long list of unspoken expectations. The sense that certain things are simply not done in Christian circles, not because Jesus ever said a single word against them, but because somewhere along the line, someone in a position of authority made a decision, and that decision became a rule. The rule became a tradition, the tradition became a norm, and the norm became invisible, absorbed so completely into the culture of faith that it began to feel like it had always been part of the foundation itself, rather than something constructed by human hands and placed over time where the foundation should be. This video is about that gap, about that distance between the Jesus you find in the Gospels when you read them slowly, carefully, honestly. The Jesus who ate with sinners and turned water into wine and wept at graves and welcomed children and told stories that made people laugh and think and rethink everything, and the religion that has sometimes been built in his name, a religion that has in certain forms and certain eras been considerably more restrictive, considerably more suspicious, and considerably more heavy than the one it claims to follow. More specifically, this is about 9 things that Jesus never once forbade, 9 areas of human life and experience that he never condemned, never warned against, never instructed his followers to avoid, but that the church, in various traditions and throughout various eras of history, has treated with suspicion, restriction, quiet discouragement, or outright prohibition. These are not obscure edge cases on the margins of Christian experience. These are central things that affect real people every single day. Things that touch on how we eat, how we move, how we relate to others, how we think, how we create, how we rest, how we grieve, and how we understand the very shape of the life God intends for his people. Now, before we go any further together, let me be transparent about what this video is not trying to do, because the framing matters enormously, and I do not want to be misunderstood. This is not an attack on the church. The church is the body of Christ in the world, and despite its many failures, and there have been many, some of them catastrophic, some of them ongoing, it has also been the vessel through which the gospel has been carried across continents and through centuries, through war and plague and persecution and cultural revolution, into the hearts of billions of people who found in it real hope, real healing, real transformation. The church is not the enemy here, not even close. This is also not a call to abandon theological tradition altogether or to treat every boundary and every structure as automatically suspect. Tradition exists for reasons. Structures serve purposes. The accumulated wisdom of 2,000 years of Christian reflection is not nothing, and the person who discards it casually because it is inconvenient is not thereby becoming more like Jesus. They may just be becoming more like themselves, which is a different thing entirely. And this is most certainly not a permission slip to do whatever feels good and dress it up in the language of grace and freedom. That is one of the oldest and most persistent errors in the history of Christian thought, and it is not what we are doing here. What this genuinely is, what I want it to be in every moment of this conversation, is an invitation to look more closely and more carefully at the actual words and the actual actions of Jesus himself, to sit with the gospel slowly, to ask the honest, searching question, did he actually say this? Did he forbid this? Does this restriction genuinely come from the mouth of the one who looked at a group of tired, burdened people and said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free"? Or does it come from somewhere else? From a cultural moment, from a theological interpretation, from a well-intentioned but ultimately human decision that got calcified into something it was never meant to be? Because here is something that faithful, Bible-loving, deeply committed Christians across many different traditions have discovered when they slow down and look carefully at the Gospels with fresh eyes. Jesus was far more expansive in his grace than many of his followers have been, far more generous in the freedom he offered, far less interested in building walls and patrolling the edges of acceptable behavior than the religious culture that surrounded him, and the religious cultures that have sometimes grown up around his name ever since. He ate with sinners at a time when table fellowship was one of the most charged social and religious acts a person could perform. He touched lepers when touching them meant ritual impurity. He spoke with Samaritans when speaking with them meant crossing a centuries-old ethnic and theological fault line. He healed on the Sabbath when healing on the Sabbath violated the interpretation of the law that the most respected religious authorities of his day had carefully developed and publicly enforced. He welcomed children when his disciples thought children were a distraction. He received the worship of a sinful woman when his host thought her touch was contaminating. He spoke tenderly to the divorced, the diseased, the demonized, and the despised, and he did not do any of this reluctantly or apologetically. He did it because it was the truth, because the walls were wrong, because the religion that had been built up around the living God of Israel had, in certain crucial respects, stopped looking like the living God of Israel and started looking like the anxieties and social hierarchies of the people doing the building. That is the spirit in which we approach these 9 things today, not with a desire to be provocative for the sake of being provocative, not to create controversy or to build an audience on the basis of telling people what they want to hear, but to be honest and careful and genuinely loving toward both the scriptures and the people who are trying to live by them, to look at what Jesus actually said and did, and to ask with all the earnestness we can bring to the question whether some of the walls built in his name were ever really his idea in the first place. So let us begin. And before we go any further, I want to pause for just a moment to invite you into this community, because what you are about to engage with is better when you engage with it together. Right now, before we go any further, I want to stop and genuinely connect with you, because you being here matters to me. You are not just a viewer. You are a person who cares enough about your faith to ask the harder questions, to keep looking, to keep going deeper, and that is something worth honoring. Would you do something for me right now? Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from. It does not matter whether you are in a small town in Texas or a flat in London, whether you are watching from the coast of California or the highlands of Scotland, from Nigeria or New Zealand, from Brazil or the Philippines or anywhere else on this extraordinary planet. Tell me where you are, because every single time I read through the comments on this channel and I see the places people are watching from, I am genuinely moved by the reach of this community, by the fact that people from so many different countries, cultures, backgrounds, and life experiences are gathering around the same questions, the same scriptures, the same desire to know God more honestly and more deeply. That is something. That is something real and beautiful, and your comment is part of it. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I want to ask you sincerely from the heart, not as a scripted line, but as a genuine request, please subscribe. Right now, while you are thinking about it, hit that subscribe button, because this channel exists for people exactly like you, People who love Jesus, who take the Bible seriously, who refuse to accept shallow answers to deep questions, who want their faith to be real and personal and genuinely life-changing rather than just a set of Sunday habits and inherited assumptions. Your subscription is not just a number to me. Every single subscriber represents a person who has decided that this kind of honest, searching, grace-filled conversation is worth their time. That means everything. There is also something I want to mention that I think you will love. You can become a channel member. And when you do, you step into something even closer than just subscribing. You become part of an inner circle of this community. You get early access to new videos before they go public, so you are always among the first to engage with this content. You get to be part of a space where people who are genuinely serious about their faith come together and go deeper together. If that sounds like something you are hungry for, look for the membership option just below this video. We would love to have you in that circle. This is a global community, and wherever you are watching from, you belong here. Now let us go deep. Lesson 1. Enjoying food and the pleasures of the table. There is a long, complicated, and often unexamined relationship between Christianity and food, and not just the specific dietary questions that go all the way back to the kosher laws of the Old Testament and the sharp debates of the early church about what Gentile believers were and were not required to eat. Something more fundamental than that. A suspicion running beneath the surface of certain Christian traditions, like a slow underground current of pleasure in eating itself. A theology, sometimes stated but more often simply assumed, absorbed from the surrounding culture of faith without being formally examined, that says enjoying your food too much is somehow spiritually dangerous, that feasting is indulgence, that delighting in a meal is uncomfortably close to gluttony, that the truly holy, the truly serious, the truly committed follower of Jesus eats sparingly and joylessly as a matter of function and fuel rather than pleasure and gratitude. This suspicion has deep and traceable roots in Christian history, and understanding those roots helps us see how thoroughly unbiblical they actually are. A significant portion of it comes from the influence of Greek philosophical traditions on the early church, particularly the strain of thought associated with Platonism and certain later Neoplatonic developments, which viewed the material world, and especially the body and its appetites, as inherently inferior to the realm of spirit and reason. In this framework, the appetites of the body are not gifts to be received with gratitude and ordered well. They are obstacles to the soul's ascent toward the divine, competitors for the attention and energy that should be directed upward. The wise and virtuous person disciplines the body's desires, minimizes them, transcends them. The person who genuinely enjoys eating is, in this framework, someone who is still too attached to the lower things, still too much a creature of the material world, still insufficiently spiritual. This is not a Christian idea. It predates Christianity by centuries and actually stands in direct tension with the Hebrew and biblical understanding of creation, which insists that the material world, including the body, including food, including pleasure, is the good creation of a good God, not a trap or a burden or a lesser realm to be escaped. But the influence was powerful and early, and it shaped Christian ascetic practice, monastic tradition, and popular piety in ways that persisted long after the formal theological systems that generated it had been left behind. The practical result, passed down through the centuries, is that many Christians have come to the table carrying a kind of ambient guilt. A sense that if you are really enjoying this meal, if the flavors are genuinely delighting you, if you are having a second helping because it is wonderful and you want more of it, if you are taking pleasure in the craft and the artistry of what someone has prepared, you might be loving it a little too much. That a truly spiritual person would not care about food this way. That the saint eats what is put in front of them without fuss, without excitement, without the kind of evident enjoyment that suggests the material world might be offering something genuinely worth enjoying. And yet, when you turn to the Gospels and actually look at Jesus, not at the stained glass Jesus of religious imagination, but at the actual person described in the actual text of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what you find is something so radically different from this picture that it should stop us cold. Jesus was, by the testimony of his own contemporaries, including and especially his critics, someone who loved to eat and drink in the company of others. This is not a minor background detail. This is not something we have to read between the lines to discover. It is something that was so visible, so consistent, and so characteristic of his public behavior that it became one of the primary complaints that his religious opponents leveled against him. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus himself quotes the accusation, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, 'Look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.'" He was not a glutton or a drunkard. He was refuting those specific charges, which were rhetorical exaggerations designed to discredit him. But the accusations did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from the observable fact that Jesus was regularly, publicly, visibly, someone who ate and drank with enthusiasm, with pleasure, in the company of all kinds of people, at all kinds of tables, without apology or apparent discomfort about what the religious observers thought of it. Look at the account of the wedding at Cana in John's Gospel, the very first miracle Jesus performed, according to John, and therefore the one the Gospel writer chose to introduce to the reader as the opening act of Jesus' public ministry. The wine ran out at a wedding feast. This was a social disaster in the culture of the time, a failure of hospitality that would have brought real embarrassment and shame to the hosting family. And Jesus' response was not to use the moment as an opportunity to teach about the spiritual dangers of celebration, or to suggest that the guests had already drunk enough and perhaps this was a providential reminder of the virtues of moderation. He made more wine. He made it supernaturally, instantaneously, in enormous quantity. John tells us the jars held somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons. And when the master of the banquet tasted it, he remarked that it was the best wine of the entire evening. Not just adequate wine, not just more wine, the best wine. Think about what this means as the opening statement of a ministry that the gospel writer is presenting to us as the disclosure of who God is. The first thing Jesus does publicly is ensure that a party does not end prematurely. He makes sure there is enough wine, enough excellent wine, for the celebration to continue. This is not the action of someone who was theologically or spiritually suspicious of feasting and pleasure. This is the action of someone who looked at a celebration and thought, "This is good. This should continue," and then used his power to make sure it did. Look further at the way Jesus consistently used meals and feasting and the imagery of the table in his teaching about the kingdom of God. The kingdom, he said again and again, is like a banquet, a great feast to which people are invited, urgently, insistently, almost desperately invited by a host who wants his table full. In Luke chapter 14, the invited guests make excuses and do not come, and the host's response is not to cancel the party. He sends his servants out into the streets, into the roads and the alleyways, and tells them to bring in anyone they can find, the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame, until the house is full. The feast happens regardless. The celebration goes forward. The host is determined that there will be joy at his table. And then the parable of the prodigal son, which we cannot pass by in any honest conversation about Jesus and celebration. When the younger son comes home, broken, empty, prepared to arrive as a servant, the father does not receive him with a measured and cautious welcome. He runs. He runs down the road, throws his arms around his son, calls for the best robe and the family ring and the sandals that mark a member of the household rather than a servant. And then, kill the fatted calf. Let us eat and celebrate. Let us have music. Let us have dancing. This is not a subdued and dignified homecoming. This is an extravagant party. This is a father so overjoyed that he cannot wait to express it through feasting and celebration and the best food in the house offered freely and excessively to the one who had been lost. Jesus told that story. He put those words in the mouth of the Father. He designed that portrait of divine welcome with a feast at its center, because the feast, the table, the shared meal, the food and drink prepared and offered in abundance, was for Jesus a natural and essential image of what grace actually looks like in real life. You cannot read the Gospels carefully and come away believing that Jesus thought there was something spiritually dangerous about enjoying a meal. What you come away believing is that he thought there was something profoundly true and profoundly revelatory about it. That a good meal shared with the people you love is a small and genuine image of the abundance that God has always intended for his creation. He ate with Zacchaeus, not just briefly, not just as a pastoral duty, but in a way that caused genuine scandal among those who watched. He ate with Simon the Pharisee. He ate with Mary and Martha. He fed 5,000 people on a hillside. And when they had eaten their fill, there were 12 baskets of fragments left over. After his resurrection, he appeared on a beach and had fish cooking on a fire, and he ate with his disciples there. In one of the most extraordinary and tender scenes in the entire New Testament, the risen Lord sharing breakfast on a beach. He broke bread with his disciples in the upper room, and made that breaking of bread the central act of remembrance that his church would continue to perform in his name until he returned. He used bread and wine, the most basic, most elemental, most universal foods of ordinary human life, as the symbols of his own body and blood, his own self poured out. The meal was not incidental to his theology. The meal was central to it. The table was not just a setting, it was a statement about who God is and what he is doing in the world. Jesus never forbade the enjoyment of food. He never cautioned against feasting. He never held up the joyless, suspicious eater as the model of Christian virtue. What he cautioned against, and it is worth being clear about this, was not enjoyment but the specific failures of gluttony and the neglect of the poor. Those are real concerns, and they matter. The person who feasts extravagantly while their neighbor goes hungry has a problem that is not about the food, but about the heart. But that is a different thing entirely from the ambient suspicion of pleasure at the table that certain Christian traditions have promoted. One is a moral concern rooted in love for neighbor. The other is a philosophical inheritance from a pre-Christian tradition that Jesus never endorsed. The table is a place of grace. It always has been in the vision of Jesus. And the next time you sit down to a meal that genuinely delights you, when the food is wonderful and the company is warm and there is bread worth tearing and something in the glass worth tasting, you are not indulging a spiritual weakness. You are, in a small and beautiful and very human way, participating in something that Jesus himself loved. Receive it with gratitude. Eat with joy. Let the pleasure of a good meal be what it is, a gift freely given from a God who made taste buds and flavor and the extraordinary human experience of sitting together and sharing food, and who looked at all of it and said it was good. Lesson 2. Drinking wine and sharing in celebration. Since we are already at the table, we should address the question that naturally follows, the one that has generated perhaps more heat, more controversy, more sharply divided opinion, and more genuine pastoral confusion than almost any other practical question in the history of Protestant Christianity in particular. The question of alcohol. In specific and influential streams of Christian tradition, particularly those shaped and formed by the temperance movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries in Britain and America. Abstinence from alcohol became not merely a personal choice, but a cultural marker of Christian seriousness, a sign of genuine commitment, a test of character, and eventually, in some communities, something very close to a doctrinal position. Drinking was sinful, not potentially problematic in certain contexts, not something to approach with care and wisdom, not a matter requiring thoughtfulness about one's own history and community and the effect of one's choices on others, but simply, categorically, straightforwardly sinful. And if you drank, your spiritual credibility was genuinely in question. You might love Jesus sincerely, you might serve faithfully, you might give generously, you might live with remarkable integrity in every other area of your life. But if you had a glass of wine with dinner, you had a problem. This view became so embedded in certain communities that it felt like the obvious, natural, biblical position, as though it had always been there, as though the traditions stretched back through the centuries in an unbroken line to Jesus himself, as though Jesus himself had clearly and plainly prohibited alcohol and the faithful were simply following his lead. He did not. This needs to be stated clearly, carefully, and without hedging, because a great deal of genuine harm has been done by the misrepresentation of what Jesus actually said and did on this subject. We have already discussed the miracle at Cana, but it deserves closer attention in this context because it is simply impossible to overstate how directly and comprehensively it contradicts the position that Jesus regarded drinking as sinful. Jesus did not merely tolerate the presence of wine at the wedding. He did not hold his nose and make more wine because the guests would have been upset without it. He supernaturally produced somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons of high-quality wine. Wine that the master of the banquet described as the best of the evening, at a celebration that was already well underway and at which people had already been drinking. The account gives no indication that Jesus was reluctant about this, uncomfortable with it, concerned about the message it sent, or working against his better theological judgment. He made wine, good wine, a lot of it, as his first miracle, at a party. If Jesus believed that drinking wine was inherently sinful, if his moral and theological framework included alcohol as something his followers should categorically avoid, this miracle is not just surprising, it is incomprehensible. It is the creator of the universe using his divine power to produce a substance he believed to be sinful in large quantities for people to consume at a celebration. No serious reading of the Gospels supports that interpretation. The miracle at Cana is, among other things, a clear and unambiguous indication of what Jesus actually thought about wine, celebration, and the goodness of the gifts that human culture has developed around them. And Cana is not a single anomaly. The Last Supper, the most sacred meal in Christian history, the act of worship that Jesus specifically instituted as the ongoing sacrament of remembrance for his church, was conducted with wine. Not grape juice, not a symbolic representation of wine, but wine in the context of the Jewish Passover meal, in which wine has always been an integral and theologically significant component. When Jesus said, "I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God," he was not expressing relief that the obligation to drink wine was finally ending. He was making a profoundly moving statement about the fellowship and the reunion and the shared joy that awaited on the other side of the cross. And wine, real wine, the wine he had just shared with his friends around the table, was the image through which he expressed that hope. Consider also the texture of the accusations that were leveled against Jesus during his ministry. His opponents, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the religious authorities who found his behavior consistently, almost obsessively offensive, called him, among other things, a glutton and a drunkard. They said this to discredit him, And Jesus refuted the charges as exaggerations designed to dismiss him. But accusations, to carry any weight at all, must bear some relationship to observable reality, and this one clearly did. Jesus was regularly, visibly, publicly seen drinking in the company of others, including the company of people the religious community had written off as disreputable. His enemies described it as drunkenness, which was a smear, but the underlying behavior, drinking wine socially at tables in the company of all kinds of people, was real and observable. He did not hide it. He did not apologize for it. He let it be what it was, an ordinary, human, joyful part of shared life. Now, and this matters because the point here is not license but honesty. None of this is a suggestion that the Bible is indifferent to the misuse of alcohol. It is absolutely not. Proverbs speaks with considerable bluntness and poetic vividness about the dangers of strong drink and the specific kind of self-destruction that excessive drinking produces. The New Testament is clear that drunkenness is incompatible with life in the Spirit. Paul says so directly in Ephesians, and the word he uses carries the sense of a loss of control, of being governed by the wine rather than by the Spirit. The person who habitually drinks to the point of impairment, who uses alcohol to escape or to numb, who cannot engage with their life without the assistance of a drink, this person has a genuine problem that the Bible genuinely addresses. And for the millions of people who carry a personal history with addiction, dependency, or the devastation that alcohol-related harm has brought into their families and their lives, abstinence may not just be wise, but necessary. There is no judgment here, none at all, for anyone who chooses not to drink for any reason. That is a completely valid choice, a potentially deeply wise one, and in some life circumstances, an act of genuine self-care and care for others. But here is the crucial point: that choice is a choice. It is a personal decision shaped by wisdom and conscience and pastoral care and specific life circumstances, and it belongs in the category of personal conviction rather than universal command. What it is not, what it genuinely, demonstrably, textually cannot be without doing serious violence to the Gospels, is the teaching of Jesus. Jesus never gave that command. He never described wine as sinful. He never warned his disciples to avoid it. He turned water into it. He drank it with his friends across many meals. He used it as the symbol of his own blood in the meal of his remembrance. Whatever conversation Christians need to have about wisdom and moderation and the specific pastoral challenges around alcohol in contemporary life, and that conversation is worth having, it cannot begin with the premise that Jesus forbade drinking, because he did not. Lesson 3. Dancing and the joy of the body in motion. Here is one that will raise eyebrows in certain quarters. And the very fact that it raises eyebrows is itself one of the most important things about it, because it tells us something revealing about the gap between the teaching of Jesus and the cultural assumptions of certain Christian traditions. There are Christian communities in which dancing has been, and in some cases still is, forbidden or strongly discouraged. Not liturgical movement in a worship context. That is a somewhat different conversation and one that has its own interesting history. But social dancing. Dancing at weddings. Dancing at birthday parties. Dancing at family celebrations. The kind of physical, joyful, whole-body expression of delight and vitality that human beings across every known culture and throughout all of recorded history have used to mark occasions of happiness, of worship, of community, of the kind of joy that simply cannot be contained in stillness. In some Christian traditions, this prohibition has been explicit, formal, and enforceable, something that church members were held accountable for. In others, it has been more of an unspoken cultural assumption, a vague sense that good Christian people, serious Christian people, people who are really oriented toward heaven rather than earth, simply do not spend their time dancing at parties, that it is too worldly, too physical, too close to things that are genuinely problematic. The origins of this suspicion are worth tracing because they are genuinely instructive. A significant portion of it comes from the same philosophical distrust of the body that we have already encountered in relation to food, the deeply ingrained assumption derived from Greek thought rather than Hebrew scripture, that the body and its pleasures and its expressive capacities are spiritually suspect, that physical joy is a lower-order thing standing in competition with spiritual aspiration, that the truly holy person transcends bodily delight rather than inhabiting it fully and gratefully. Dancing, in this framework, is precisely the kind of thing the body does when it is not being governed by the spirit. It is pleasure and expression and movement and a kind of abandon that looks uncomfortably like the opposite of the disciplined, upward-oriented, gravity-laden seriousness that holiness is supposed to look like. Some of the suspicion also comes from very real and legitimate pastoral concerns about the specific contexts in which dancing can occur and the behaviors it can sometimes occasion. Dancing can happen in environments that are genuinely harmful. It can become an avenue for sexual exploitation or manipulation. It can be used in ways that degrade or objectify. These are real concerns, and they deserve to be named as such. But the response to the misuse of something is not the categorical prohibition of the thing itself, not unless Jesus specifically gave that prohibition, and he did not. What did Jesus say about dancing? He said nothing against it, absolutely nothing. There is not a single syllable in the entirety of the four Gospels in which Jesus discourages, warns against, or expresses theological concern about dancing. What he did say about it is enormously instructive. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus describes the children in the marketplace playing games and calling to each other, "We played the flute for you, and you did not dance." He uses this image, the image of children playing music and expecting a dancing response, to describe the posture of the religious establishment toward his ministry. They were playing the flute, and the religious leaders refused to dance. They were singing the dirge, and the religious leaders refused to mourn. In other words, they were unresponsive, inflexible, unable to enter into either joy or sorrow, unwilling to let the movement of God's action actually move them. Dancing, in this image, is the appropriate and natural human response to music, to joy, to invitation. The problem Jesus identifies is not that people dance too much. The problem is that the religious leaders would not dance at all, would not let themselves be moved, would not let their bodies and their spirits respond to what was being offered. Their refusal to dance was a symptom of a deeper, more serious problem, a calcified, defended heart that had made itself immune to genuine response. And then there is the parable of the prodigal son again. And we keep returning to it because it keeps offering us more than we first noticed. When the father throws his celebration for the son who has come home, the older brother is walking in from the fields, and he hears from a distance the sound of music and dancing. Not just music, music and dancing. These are the sounds that are coming from inside the father's house on the occasion of the son's return. The dancing is not incidental. It is not a regrettable excess that the father permits despite his better judgment. It is simply part of what the celebration looks and sounds like. It is what joy in the Father's household actually does. And Jesus put it there, in the story, deliberately. He could have told the same parable without the dancing. He chose to include it, because dancing, physical, communal, joyful movement of bodies in celebration, was for Jesus a completely natural image of what it looks and sounds like when something wonderful happens. The Old Testament tradition that Jesus was steeped in and that formed his entire theological imagination is, if anything, even more enthusiastic about dancing than the New. David danced before the ark of the Lord with all his might, in an act of such uninhibited physical joy that his wife Michal was embarrassed by it, and David's response to her embarrassment was essentially, "You have not seen anything yet." Miriam took a tambourine and led the women in dancing after the deliverance at the Red Sea. The Psalms call the congregation to praise God with dancing, not as a metaphor, but as an actual instruction for worship. Psalm 150, the great closing doxology of the entire Hebrew Psalter, the last word that the Psalms offer on the subject of how to praise God, explicitly includes dancing among the instruments and forms of worship. The tradition Jesus inherited was a tradition in which the body, including the dancing body, was a legitimate and celebrated vehicle for the expression of joy and worship. He never contradicted that tradition. He never modified it. He never said, yes, the Old Testament permitted dancing, but in the New Covenant community, we have moved to a higher, more spiritual form of worship that leaves the body behind. He used dancing as an image of the right response to joy. He put it in the mouth of the Father at the greatest homecoming in the most famous story he ever told. He never forbade it. The tradition that has treated dancing as categorically unchristian, as a symptom of worldliness or a threat to holiness, has built that tradition on foundations that do not come from Jesus. They come from a philosophy of the body that predates Christianity, that contradicts the Hebrew understanding of embodied human life that Jesus himself inherited and affirmed. And that has caused real and unnecessary harm to real and sincere believers who were told to feel guilty about something that Jesus never once called sinful. Lesson 4. Asking hard questions and living with doubt. This may be the most personally significant lesson on this entire list for many of the people watching this video, because the experience it addresses is one of the most common and least spoken about in Christian communities everywhere. The experience of doubt, the experience of not knowing, the experience of wrestling with questions that do not have clean, comfortable answers, and finding, to your bewilderment and sometimes your shame, that the community of faith does not always know what to do with you when you bring those questions into the room. There is a version of Christian culture, and it is important to be honest, that this version appears across many different traditions, not just the obviously conservative ones, in which doubt is treated as the functional opposite of faith, in which uncertainty is treated as a kind of spiritual failure, a symptom of insufficient trust, a warning sign that something has gone wrong in your relationship with God, in which the unspoken but clearly communicated message to the questioning believer is, if your faith were real, you would not need to ask. If your relationship with God were where it should be, these doubts would not be tormenting you. Stop asking so many questions. Stop overthinking. Just believe. It is a crushing message, and for many sincere, thoughtful, intelligent, genuinely seeking people, it has been one of the most damaging things that the institutional church has done, not by persecuting them, not by rejecting them dramatically or publicly, but simply by failing to make room for them. By creating a culture in which the only acceptable public spiritual experience is one of confident, comfortable certainty, in which anyone who deviates from that performance of assurance feels like an outsider in their own community of faith, like someone who does not quite belong, like someone whose questions are a problem rather than a sign of a genuinely engaged and honest mind. Most Christian traditions would say, in their official statements and in their best moments, that questions are welcome, that intellectual inquiry is part of the life of faith, that faith and reason are not enemies, that the long tradition of Christian theology has always included rigorous, sometimes ferociously honest intellectual engagement with the hardest questions about God and human existence, and at their best, they mean it. But there is often a ceiling that becomes visible under pressure, a point at which the welcome for questions runs out. A tacit distinction between the questions that are acceptable, theological fine-tuning, historical curiosity, the kind of intellectual engagement that does not threaten the core, and the questions that are not. The questions about whether God is real, whether the resurrection happened, whether the universe is indifferent, whether prayer actually does anything, whether you are even capable of believing what you are supposed to believe. Those questions tend to be met with a kind of nervous pastoral management rather than honest, open engagement. And yet, when you actually look at how Jesus engaged with people across the full breadth of the gospel narratives, in every kind of context, with every kind of person, what you find is someone who was remarkably, consistently, almost programmatically open to questions. Not just the polite, easy, already on the way to faith questions, the hard ones, the hostile ones, the ones that came from real pain and real confusion and real unwillingness to pretend. The case of Thomas is perhaps the most famous, and it deserves to be spent more time on than it usually gets, because the tradition of calling him Doubting Thomas, as though doubt were his defining characteristic and his defining failure, has done Thomas a genuine injustice and done the rest of us a significant disservice. Thomas, when the other disciples told him they had seen the risen Jesus, said plainly that he would not believe it without evidence. He needed to see the wounds. He needed something tangible, something that corresponded to the specific claims being made. He was not going to take it on faith alone, not in this case, not about something this significant, and Jesus did not rebuke him for that. Let that settle for a moment. The risen Lord appeared in the room where Thomas was, and his response to Thomas's expressed demand for evidence was not correction, not disappointment, not a lecture on the virtue of believing without seeing. He came to Thomas. He offered Thomas exactly what Thomas had asked for, the wounds, the hands, the side, and he said, gently, firmly, with complete love, "Stop doubting and believe." That is an invitation, not a condemnation. That is a Savior who takes a doubter's specific stated need seriously enough to meet it. And the result, Thomas's response of "My Lord and my God," is one of the most complete, most profound, most theologically rich declarations of faith in the entire New Testament. Thomas's doubt was not the opposite of his faith. It was the road through which his faith arrived at its deepest and most honest expression. Or consider John the Baptist in prison in the account recorded in Matthew chapter 11. John had given his entire life to preparing the way for Jesus. He had preached repentance, baptized thousands, declared the coming kingdom, and pointed to Jesus as the one he had been preparing for. And now he was in Herod's dungeon, and apparently the kingdom had not arrived in the form he had expected, and the revolution he had anticipated had not materialized, and he was alone and suffering and confused. And he sent his disciples to ask Jesus directly, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" This is not a casual question from a contented believer. This is a man in anguish, questioning whether the thing he staked his entire life on was actually true. And Jesus did not respond with correction or disappointment or a reminder that John should have stronger faith given everything he had witnessed. He sent back evidence. He pointed to the signs of what was happening: the blind seeing, the lame walking, the good news being proclaimed to the poor. And he said, "Go and tell John what you hear and see." He met John's honest, agonized doubt with gentleness and with truth. He gave John something to hold on to. He did not shame him for needing it, And then there is the cross itself. Jesus dying quotes Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is lament of the most anguished kind. This is a cry that contains within it the experience, the real, felt, overwhelming experience of abandonment, of God's apparent absence, of prayer that seems to go unanswered. Jesus did not perform triumphant certainty from the cross. He cried out from the place of genuine desolation with a question. He modeled, from the place of the most extreme human suffering, what honest faith actually looks like when everything falls apart. Not the performance of confidence, but the continued crying out to a God who sometimes, in the experience of the one crying, seems terrifyingly absent. He never forbade asking questions. He never condemned the honest, searching doubt that comes from a heart that genuinely wants to know. What he called out, and the distinction is critical, was the hardness of heart that refused to respond to clear evidence because response would be costly. The people he challenged most directly were not the doubters, but the ones who had seen miracle after undeniable miracle and had chosen, for reasons of power and position and self-protection, to remain unmoved. That is not honest doubt. That is willed blindness. And it is a completely different thing. The person who is lying awake tonight, wrestling with questions they are afraid to say out loud, wondering whether their doubt disqualifies them from the community of faith, that person is in the company of Thomas and John the Baptist and the psalmists, and ultimately of Jesus himself, who cried out from the cross with a question that has never fully resolved itself into easy answers. That person is not outside of faith. They may be at its most honest and most searching edge, and the Jesus of the Gospels would not tell them to stop asking. He would come into the room where they are hiding and offer them something to hold. Lesson 5. Genuine friendship and deep relationship with outsiders. If there is a single behavioral pattern in the life and ministry of Jesus that generated the most consistent, most heated, and most personally targeted opposition from the religious establishment of his day, it was this one. It was not his teaching about the kingdom of God, though that was threatening enough. It was not his healings, though those created serious theological complications for the authorities. It was who he ate with, who he spent time with, who he welcomed into his company, and whose company he welcomed himself into. It was the persistent, visible, apparently deliberate pattern of spending meaningful time. Sharing meals, sharing space, sharing genuine human attention with people who were, by the standards of religious culture, the wrong kind of people. Tax collectors were among the most despised people in first-century Jewish society. They were not merely disliked, they were considered traitors. They had aligned themselves with the Roman occupation, a foreign power that had conquered the land God had promised to Israel, and they collected money from their own people on behalf of that power, with the legal right to add a surcharge for themselves. They were wealthy because their neighbors were exploited. They were safe because the occupiers protected them. They had, in the eyes of most people who passed them in the marketplace, chosen Rome over God, comfort over covenant, self over community. They were not just unpleasant, they were morally contaminated. Jesus called one of them to be among his 12 closest companions. Matthew, also called Levi, was a tax collector when Jesus found him sitting at his tax booth and said, "Follow me." Matthew got up and followed. And then Matthew threw a party, and Jesus came to it. And the guest list included Matthew's tax collector friends and others who were similarly categorized as sinners. And the Pharisees who observed this were genuinely scandalized. Not mildly uncomfortable, genuinely scandalized in the way that people are scandalized when someone whose opinion they respect does something they consider morally indefensible. "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" they asked his disciples. And Jesus' response was not to apologize or to clarify that this was a special pastoral case and should not be taken as a general pattern. His response was, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." He went to Zacchaeus' house. Zacchaeus was also a tax collector. A chief tax collector, actually, which meant he was at the top of the system, the most financially successful, and therefore the most thoroughly invested in the collaboration with Rome that made people like him so reviled. And Jesus, seeing Zacchaeus up in a sycamore tree where he had climbed to get a view of Jesus passing by, stopped and looked up and said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Not, I would like to offer you a brief word of encouragement. Not, I am willing to speak with you if you come to me. I must stay at your house today." He invited himself into Zacchaeus' space, into Zacchaeus' life, with the kind of intimate directness that can only come from genuine regard. And the crowd was shocked and offended. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. And Jesus went anyway. He had a long, theologically substantive, personally revealing conversation with a Samaritan woman at a well in the heat of the day. The theological fault line between Jews and Samaritans in the first century was centuries deep, rooted in a history of ethnic conflict and religious divergence that made ordinary social contact between them unusual and meaningful contact genuinely rare. "You are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" she said. But Jesus asked, and then the conversation went deep into her personal history, her 5 marriages and current arrangement, her theological questions, her hunger for something real. His disciples, when they returned and found him talking with her, were surprised. The Greek text hints at something stronger than mild surprise. But none of them asked what he was doing, because the question already had an obvious answer. He was doing what he always did. He was being fully present to the person in front of him, regardless of the categories that said he should not be. He healed the servant of a Roman centurion, a man who was not just a Gentile, but an officer of the military force that occupied Israel. And far from being reluctant or qualified in his response, Jesus praised this man's faith as greater than anything he had found in Israel. "I have not found such great faith, even in Israel." He used a member of the occupying army as his illustration of what genuine trust in God looks like. He could not have chosen a more surprising or more cross-boundary example if he had deliberately designed it to offend the nationalistic sensibilities of his audience, which he may well have done with full awareness of what he was doing. And yet the church, not always, not everywhere, not everyone, but in recurring and significant patterns, has repeatedly developed its own version of the boundary keeping that Jesus opposed. A kind of Christian separatism that treats meaningful relationship with non-Christians as spiritually risky, that builds the community of faith as an essentially closed world in which the primary relationships are internal and the outside world is something to be engaged primarily through evangelistic strategy rather than genuine human friendship. A culture in which the unspoken message is, your most important relationships should be with other Christians. The world out there is spiritually dangerous. Be careful about how much time you spend in contexts where the people around you do not share your faith. Be strategic about your outsider relationships. Keep your spiritual distance even when you are physically present. There are legitimate concerns embedded in this tendency, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The people we spend the most time with do form us. The environments we inhabit do shape our habits of thought and behavior and desire. The question of how to maintain a clear and genuinely countercultural identity while being genuinely present in the world is a real one with no simple answer. Paul does talk about not being unequally yoked. Proverbs does talk about the influence of companions. These are real biblical concerns, But the tradition of separatism consistently misapplies these concerns in a way that produces exactly the opposite of what Jesus modeled. Because the critical thing about Jesus' presence among the tax collectors and sinners and Samaritans and centurions is that he was not changed by them into their image. He was not formed by the tax collectors he ate with. He did not absorb the values of the people he spent time with. He was fully and consistently himself in every company, and in being fully and consistently himself, he made space for something to happen in them. He was salt and light. Salt flavors and preserves the things it touches, which means it has to be in contact with them. Light illuminates the room it is in, which means it has to be in the room. You cannot be salt from a sealed container or light from behind a closed door. Jesus never forbade genuine friendship with people outside the faith. He never taught his disciples to keep their outsider relationships strategic and shallow. He never modeled a life of spiritual quarantine in which the primary discipline was maintaining safe distance from people who might contaminate you. He modeled the extraordinary and transformative power of genuine human presence, of showing up, of eating together, of seeing the specific person in front of you as someone worth your time and your full attention and your real engagement, regardless of whether they already believed what you believed or lived the way you lived. The walls that Christian culture has sometimes built around the community of faith, the tacit rules that restrict meaningful outsider relationship, the culture of strategic rather than genuine presence in the world, these are not the teaching of Jesus. And the loneliness, the insularity, and the ultimate ineffectiveness that they produce are their own testimony to the fact that they were never his idea. Lesson 6. Laughter, humor, joy, and the lightness of spirit. There is a particular image of Christian holiness that has had remarkable persistence across the centuries and across many different traditions. The image of the grave and solemn believer. The person whose countenance is permanently oriented toward the weightier realities, sin, judgment, eternity, the suffering of the world, and who therefore carries themselves with a kind of studied seriousness that marks them as someone who really gets it, someone who truly understands the stakes, someone who has not been seduced by the lightness and frivolity with which the unreflective masses navigate their lives. This image presents itself as the logical and even necessary outcome of taking God and his purposes seriously. It communicates without usually stating it directly. The world is fallen, sin is catastrophic, souls hang in the balance, time is short, and anyone who genuinely grasps these realities will not have much space in their life for easy laughter and playful humor and the unguarded delight of a spirit that finds things genuinely funny. There is a version of this, a genuine, deep, historically serious version that has real spiritual substance. The laughter that makes fun of the broken and the suffering is cruelty dressed as comedy. The humor that demeans or objectifies or reduces human beings to punchlines has nothing to do with the joy Jesus talked about. The frivolity that uses humor as a permanent defense against having to feel anything real, the person who is always laughing because they have trained themselves never to be moved, that is not spiritual health. That is a kind of numbness that resembles peace from the outside, but is not peace. But the suspicion of joy itself, the theological unease with laughter as such, with the simple pleasure of something genuinely funny, with the lightness of spirit that comes from being genuinely happy and not feeling guilty about it, this does not have its roots in the teaching of Jesus. It has its roots in a particular reading of Christian seriousness that has forgotten, or perhaps never fully absorbed, the texture of Jesus' actual presence as his contemporaries experienced it. We do not have a gospel account that says, "and Jesus laughed." We should be honest about that. The gospel writers were telling a story of cosmic, eternal, universe-altering significance in a limited number of words, and they were not primarily recording the social texture of Jesus's daily interactions. But we have other evidence, the kind of evidence that comes from reading the whole picture carefully rather than looking for a single proof text. We have a man so magnetically warm, so humanly alive and present and engaging, that children ran to him. Not to a solemn religious authority figure, not to a grave and intimidating holy man, to someone whose presence felt safe and welcoming and joyful. So obviously, so visibly good to be around that children, who are among the least deferential and most honest barometers of whether someone is actually enjoyable to be with, sought him out enthusiastically. You do not produce that response if you are a relentlessly grim presence. We have a man who was welcomed at parties, who was invited to dinners, who was sought out for social occasions by people who did not owe him any particular professional deference and were not coming to him with specific theological questions. People wanted Jesus at their table. That doesn't happen to the perpetually solemn. And we have his teaching itself, specifically the quality, the texture, the tonal range of his teaching, which includes moments of what can only be described as wit. The camel going through the eye of a needle is, among other things, funny. It is an absurd and vivid image, a deliberately ridiculous picture designed to make a serious point in a way that a dry propositional statement could not. The person trying to remove a speck from their brother's eye while a plank is sticking out of their own. This is comedy. It is comic exaggeration deployed in the service of moral insight, and it works precisely because the image makes you smile, because the incongruity lands and you recognize yourself or someone you know in it, and then the recognition goes deep. The Pharisees straining out gnats while swallowing camels, the precision of the juxtaposition, the escalating absurdity. This is not a humorless man doing serious theology. This is someone with a genuine feel for the comic and the ironic, and the use of laughter as a vehicle for truth. He said that he came so that his followers would have life and have it abundantly. The Greek word translated abundantly does not mean adequate or sufficient or enough. It means overflowing, excessive, beyond what was expected, more than enough. A life of abundant flourishing does not sound like a life in which joy has been evacuated in the name of appropriate seriousness. He described the kingdom of God as a wedding feast, as a party thrown for a returning son, as a woman who searches for a lost coin and then calls her neighbors together to celebrate, as a shepherd who finds his lost sheep and throws a party. The dominant images of the kingdom in the teaching of Jesus are images of celebration, reunion, relief, and joy. Not solemn duty, not quiet endurance, joy. He said, "Rejoice and be glad, and do not let your hearts be troubled, and my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete." The joy he was pointing toward was not a performance of happiness as a witness strategy. It was something he wanted for his followers, because it was real and worth having and connected to the deepest truths about God and about what he was doing in the world. Jesus never forbade joy. He never held up the permanently somber believer as the model of mature Christian faith. He never cautioned against laughter or the easy, unguarded pleasure of something genuinely funny. The tradition that has equated Christian seriousness with the absence of lightheartedness has read the Gospels selectively and missed something essential about the spirit of the one it is trying to follow. Lesson 7. Creative work, art, and the making of beautiful things. There is a tension that many Christians who work in creative fields, in visual art, in music, in film, in literature, in theater, in design, in architecture, in any of the forms through which human beings make things that are intended to be beautiful or meaningful or resonant, have felt with particular sharpness and personal cost. the tension between their faith and their craft, between the community in which they worship and the world in which they work, between a version of Christian culture that has at various times and in various forms been suspicious of artistic expression, that has narrowed its definition of acceptable creative work to explicitly religious themes, explicitly devotional purposes, and explicitly redemptive conclusions, and the vast, complex, morally ambiguous, deeply human territory of art-making that does not fit into those narrow categories and was not designed to. This tension has a real and traceable history in the Church. There have been extraordinary moments when Christianity was the greatest patron of the arts in Western civilization, when the construction of a cathedral was understood as an act of worship as serious and as sacred as any prayer, when the painting of an altarpiece was experienced as a form of contemplation and offering, when the greatest composers of the Western tradition explicitly understood their work as a gift to God, and inscribed their manuscripts with Latin phrases dedicating them to the divine glory. Bach, Michelangelo, Dante, the builders of Chartres, the icon painters of Byzantium. This tradition is real and glorious and deeply embedded in the history of the Church at its best. But there have also been moments, significant, widespread, culturally powerful moments, when the arts were treated with suspicion or outright hostility, when the decorated church was stripped bare in the name of purity, when complex and ornate music was replaced with the plain and the simple on the grounds that beauty was seductive and therefore dangerous, when the image was torn from the wall because the image might become an idol. And beyond those dramatic historical moments, there has been a persistent and quieter tendency in Christian subculture, particularly in certain strains of evangelical and fundamentalist culture in the 20th and 21st centuries, to draw a sharp and hierarchical line between two kinds of creative work. On one side, Christian art that explicitly names God, carries direct devotional content, leads transparently and without detour to a message of redemption, and fits comfortably within the category of ministry. On the other side, secular art. Everything else, art that engages with human experience in all its complexity, art that asks questions rather than providing answers. Art that is honest about darkness rather than rushing to the light. Art that is made by Christians, but not about Christianity in the narrow sense. This kind of art, the vast majority of what any serious creative person spends their life making, has sometimes been treated as a kind of spiritual compromise, as evidence that the artist's priorities have drifted, as work that needs to be more explicitly redeemed before it can be fully endorsed by the community of faith. Jesus never drew that line. Not once. Not anywhere in the Gospels. When you look at the God that Jesus came to reveal, the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, the God of Genesis and Psalms and Job and the Song of Solomon, what you find is a God who is, from the first breath of the first chapter, a creator. The first thing the Bible tells us about God is that He creates. He makes things. He shapes and separates and names and calls forth. And when He looks at what He has made, He says it is good. And then He says it is very good. Making things, making them with care and intention, taking pleasure in what is made. This is the first revealed activity of the divine. And human beings are made in the image of this Creator God, not in the image of a divine manager or a divine rule enforcer or a divine judge, in the image of a Creator. Which means that when we create, when we make things with our hands and our minds and our imaginations, when we bring order and beauty and meaning and emotion and truth into form through whatever medium we work in, we are doing something that reflects the nature of the One in whose image we are made. We are, in the most literal and serious sense, being what we were created to be, The construction of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus is one of the most instructive passages in the entire Old Testament for this conversation, and it is almost never discussed in the context of Christian attitudes toward art and creativity, which is a significant oversight. The description of the tabernacle's construction is extraordinarily detailed. The fabrics, the embroidery, the metalwork, the precise and gorgeous craftsmanship that went into every element of this portable sanctuary. And the craftsman who oversaw the work, Bezalel, is described in terms that should stop any Christian who thinks that artistic skill is a lesser gift. See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, and in carving wood, to work in every craft. The Spirit of God, filling a craftsman, for the purpose of making beautiful things, not for preaching, not for prophecy, for artistic creation. The Song of Solomon is one of the most beautiful and the most physically specific poems in the Hebrew Bible. It celebrates human bodies with frank delight. It uses the imagery of the natural world, vineyards and spices and mountains and rivers, with a sensory richness that is unashamed and unapologetic. It is unambiguously in the canon of Scripture. It has been there since the beginning. The rabbis debated whether it belonged, and the great Rabbi Akiva settled the question definitively. It is the holiest of all the holy writings, because all the others are holy, but the Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies. It is there on purpose. Its beauty, its physicality, its celebration of human love and human bodies, all of this is intentional, canonical, sacred, and Jesus taught in stories. This point is so simple and so enormous that it is easy to pass over it without feeling its full weight. He did not primarily teach in doctrinal propositions. He did not primarily communicate through systematic theological arguments, though he was clearly capable of both. He taught in narratives, rich, layered, carefully constructed narratives with vivid characters and sharp conflicts and unexpected reversals, and the kind of memorable detail that you are still turning over in your mind decades after you first heard it. He used the tools of literary art, metaphor, irony, surprise, the telling specific detail, the twist that reframes everything you thought you understood. He was, by any reasonable definition, a literary artist. And he was this by choice. He could have taught differently. He chose parable and story and image and metaphor because he understood, as every serious artist understands, that truth enters through the imagination in ways that it sometimes cannot enter through argument alone. He never forbade creative work. He never said that art without explicit religious content is less holy than art with it. He never suggested that the painter who spends their life painting landscapes rather than altarpieces is a less faithful follower than the one whose work is explicitly devotional. The tradition that has built a hierarchy between Christian art and everything else, that has treated the creative person working in mainstream culture as a Christian who has compromised their witness, rather than a Christian who is doing the specifically human and specifically image of God work of making things. This tradition is working from assumptions that do not come from Jesus. The imagination is a gift, creativity is a gift, beauty is a gift, and the making of beautiful, true, resonant, honest things is not a distraction from the life of faith. It is, in some deep sense, one of its most natural expressions. Lesson 8. Rest, leisure, and the freedom to simply be. The culture of relentless productivity is one of the defining features of modern life in the Western world, and it has found in certain strands of Christian thought a strangely powerful theological ally, not intentionally, in most cases, not through a deliberate and conscious alliance between the gospel of economic productivity and the gospel of Jesus Christ, but functionally, practically, in the lived experience of many Christian communities, a fusion has occurred between the virtue of diligence, which is genuinely present in the biblical tradition, and the idol of perpetual busyness, which is not. The Protestant work ethic, that constellation of values around labor, vocation, diligence, and the spiritual meaning of productive work that emerged in the context of the Reformation and was analyzed with such sharp intelligence by Max Weber, has produced enormous, genuine goods. It contributed to the economic structures of the modern world. It dignified ordinary work by understanding it as a calling from God rather than merely a mechanism for economic survival. It gave generations of ordinary people a sense of meaning and purpose in their daily labor that went beyond the paycheck. These were real contributions, and they matter. But something happened over time. The work ethic became detached from the larger theological framework that gave it its proper meaning and limits. In its full and properly understood form, the Protestant work ethic was not about the glorification of work as an end in itself. It was about doing your work faithfully and well as part of a life ordered toward God, a life that had both work and worship, both labor and rest, both the active engagement with the world and the regular intentional withdrawal from it. The Sabbath was still part of the picture, and the Sabbath, real, disciplined, guilt-free rest, was not a concession to human weakness. It was a theological statement. It was an act of trust. It was a declaration that I am not the engine of my own life, that the world does not depend on my constant activity, that there is a God who is at work in the hours when I am not. But strip out the Sabbath, strip out the theology of rest, leave only the theology of work, and what you get is a distorted picture that presents perpetual busyness as the obvious outworking of Christian faithfulness. A picture in which the person who is always doing, always producing, always engaged, always available, always giving, this person is the hero. And the person who rests, who plays, who spends a Saturday afternoon reading a book for pure pleasure, or walking in the woods for no particular reason, or sitting with a friend over coffee and talking about nothing in particular. This person is laziness dressed up as rest, and this distortion finds its way into Christian communities in 1,000 small ways. The subtle judgment directed at the person who does not volunteer for every ministry. The admiration expressed for the pastor who works 7 days a week, as though their inability to rest is a sign of their devotion rather than a warning sign about their soul. The ambient pressure in certain communities to justify every leisure activity as somehow productive or redemptive. I am resting so that I can serve better. I am on vacation so that I can return refreshed and more effective. As though rest that is simply rest, without a productivity rationale, without an instrumental purpose, is somehow not quite respectable. The Sabbath is built into the structure of creation in the book of Genesis. God rested on the seventh day, not because he was tired, not because he had depleted his divine energy through 6 days of creative work, but because rest is a constitutive part of the good and ordered life. It is built into the rhythm of creation itself. The week has a structure, and the structure includes a day of stopping, a day of not doing, a day of being rather than producing. The Sabbath commandment appears in the 10 Commandments, one of only 10 instructions considered fundamental enough to be carved in stone. Right there alongside do not murder and do not steal and honor your father and mother. The command to rest is in the same moral category as the command not to kill. Think about what that means. Think about what it says about how seriously God takes the question of whether his people actually stop and rest. And then Jesus came, and some of the most famous conflicts of his ministry were about the Sabbath. But here is the thing that is absolutely critical to understand. When Jesus argued with the Pharisees about the Sabbath, he was not arguing that the Sabbath should be abolished, or that rest was unimportant, or that the Sabbath principle had been superseded by something more demanding in the new covenant. He was arguing that the human regulations that had been piled on top of the Sabbath, the elaborately detailed rules about exactly how many steps you could take, exactly what actions constituted prohibited labor, exactly how the concept of rest should be passed and defined and enforced, had completely buried the original spirit and purpose of the gift. The Sabbath had been transformed through an accumulation of well-intentioned human legislation from a gift of rest and freedom into a burden of compliance. And Jesus had no patience for that transformation. His statement on the subject is one of the clearest and most theologically important things he said about how human religious tradition relates to divine intention. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Human beings were not created to serve the institution of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created to serve human beings, to give them what they need, to honor what they are, to protect the rhythms of the human life that God designed. That means it should look and function like what it actually is. A gift, genuine rest, real freedom from the compulsion to produce, a regular, weekly, reliable permission to stop. Jesus himself rested. This is so obvious and so regularly overlooked that it is worth dwelling on. He withdrew from crowds regularly and deliberately. He went to quiet places alone. He slept on a boat in the middle of a storm so deeply that the storm did not wake him. His disciples had to physically shake him awake, and the text records this detail without any hint that the sleep was inappropriate or spiritually concerning. He simply slept deeply and thoroughly while the storm raged and his disciples panicked and the world fell apart around him. He went up mountains alone. He spent time in the wilderness. He attended parties and dinners where the evening's agenda was not ministry strategy or theological instruction, but simply being present with people in the ordinary pleasures of shared human life. He never forbade rest. He never suggested that the fully committed follower of God would maximize every waking hour for spiritual production. He never implied that leisure was a spiritual problem, or that the person spending an afternoon doing something they enjoyed simply because they enjoyed it was failing in their discipleship. What he opposed was the legalism that made even rest into a performance of compliance. He freed the Sabbath from the rules that had strangled it, so that it could actually be what it was always meant to be. You are allowed to rest. Not in the sense that rest is a guilty indulgence you are being given reluctant permission to engage in. Allowed in the sense of genuinely, freely, wholeheartedly permitted, invited even, called to it, by a God who himself rested, who built rest into the fabric of creation, who gave his people one day in 7 as a recurring declaration that they were more than their output, who sent his Son into the world as someone who knew how to sleep in a boat. Your value is not your productivity. Your identity is not your activity. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to play. You are allowed to sit still and read something for pleasure and take a walk for no particular reason and spend time doing absolutely nothing constructive and call it, honestly and without guilt, what it is. Faithfulness to the God who designed rest into the week he made. Lesson 9. Honest grief, open lament, and unresolved suffering. And now we come to the most tender subject on this list. The one that has, I believe, caused the most quiet and unseen damage in the most communities over the longest period of time. The prohibition that is almost never stated directly, but is enforced through 1,000 subtle cultural signals and unspoken expectations, and carefully managed social dynamics. The prohibition against lament. Let me describe what this looks like in practice, because naming it specifically is important. In many Christian communities, not all, and this observation is not a blanket accusation against anyone. There is a cultural pressure toward a particular and recognizable kind of spiritual positivity, an ambient expectation that faith expresses itself as joy, that joy expresses itself as happiness, and that happiness means that when someone asks how you are doing, the acceptable answer sounds like things are going reasonably well, or that you are trusting God in the difficulty, or that you have found peace in the struggle. Not because things necessarily are going well, or that you have actually found peace, but because something about the culture of the community communicates through 1,000 small interactions and implicit social cues that admitting the full extent of your suffering would be uncomfortable, inappropriate, perhaps even an implicit accusation against God's faithfulness. And so grief gets managed and minimized in public. The person in the congregation who is drowning on the inside learns, through experience, to present a composed and functioning exterior at the church door, because the culture has not actually made room for what they are carrying. They have been given, not usually through explicit teaching, but through the lived example of the community around them, a template for how Christians handle suffering. You find the lesson in it. You express gratitude for what God is teaching you through it. You hold on to the promises. You trust that something good is coming, and you move toward the testimony of how you came through, without spending too much time in the actual darkness, without naming what you are experiencing in its full unresolved weight, without the kind of raw honesty that might make the people around you unsure of what to say. And the people who are the most suffering are left alone in their suffering. Not because anyone intended to abandon them, but because the community was not equipped to go into the dark places with them, because the culture had not modeled what honest presence in the middle of unresolvable pain actually looks like, because the implicit theology of suffering in the community required a resolution that had not yet arrived. This is an enormous pastoral failure, and it is a failure that goes directly against the example and the teaching of Jesus. Jesus wept. 2 words, John 11:35. And they are arguably 2 of the most important words in the entire New Testament for this conversation. The context is the death of Lazarus, a man Jesus loved. Mary, Lazarus' sister, comes to Jesus and falls at his feet and says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And the text tells us that when Jesus saw her weeping and saw the people around her weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. He asked where they had laid him. He went to the tomb, and he wept. He wept at a grave, knowing he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. He wept knowing that in a matter of minutes, the reason for the weeping would be reversed. He wept anyway. He did not perform composed hopefulness in the face of death in order to model the right response for everyone watching. He stood at the edge of the grief of people he loved, and he let it land on him fully. He let the reality of death, even death that he was about to reverse, be real to him. And in response, he wept. The people who watched said, "See how he loved him," not "see how he taught correctly about death," not "see how he maintained theological perspective in a difficult pastoral moment." "See how he loved him." The weeping was the love. The tears were the expression of the genuine human attachment, the real grief, the deep caring that refused to be managed into something more appropriate for the occasion. And the Son of God let that grief be visible, public, real. He was deeply moved in the Garden of Gethsemane to the point of saying to his closest disciples, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He fell on his face and prayed with such intensity that the gospel writers were reaching for language that could barely contain what they were trying to describe. This was not a composed and theologically confident acceptance of a painful but understood plan. This was a man in genuine, overwhelming, almost unbearable anguish, saying so plainly in the words of a person who had not yet processed what was happening or arrived at the peace that the resurrection would eventually bring, but who was simply, honestly, with complete transparency in the middle of it. And on the cross, in the moment of the most profound suffering in human history, he cried out with the words of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is the language of desolation, not of theological understanding, not of peace, of a man in the darkness of God's apparent absence, crying out to a God who seems not to be there, asking the question that every genuinely suffering person has asked at some point in their life. Why? Where are you? Why have you left me here? Jesus did not arrive at the cross with his grief already processed. He arrived at the cross fully human, in full agony, and he cried out. And in crying out, in making that anguished, unanswered question into his final public statement before he died, he made something permanently true about what honest faith is allowed to look like. It does not have to be resolved. It does not have to be managed. It does not have to perform peace. It does not feel. It is allowed to cry out from the middle of the darkness with a question that does not yet have an answer. The Psalms, which Jesus knew intimately and quoted from throughout his ministry, and which form the backbone of Jewish and Christian worship, are saturated with exactly this kind of unresolved, anguished lament. Scholars classify more than a third of the 150 Psalms as lament psalms, prayers that express suffering, confusion, abandonment, anger, fear, and despair directly to God, without resolution, without a neat theological bow, without the kind of ending that ties everything up and makes it all make sense. Psalm 88 is one of the darkest passages in all of Scripture. It ends in darkness, literally. It expresses the experience of being utterly abandoned, of crying to God in the night and receiving no response, of feeling that God's wrath has overwhelmed everything and there is nothing left. And it is in the canon of Scripture. It is there on purpose. It is there because the community of faith needed to be told, in the most authoritative way available to them, that this experience, the experience of genuine, unresolved, apparently unanswered suffering, was something that could be brought to God honestly without destroying your faith or disqualifying you from the community. The tradition that creates a culture of performative positivity in Christian communities that implicitly tells suffering people to manage their grief publicly in the direction of gratitude and testimony, that makes the raw and unresolved experience of pain feel like something to be ashamed of, rather than something to be carried openly in community. This tradition is working directly against the example of Jesus and the tradition of the Psalms he prayed from. Grief is allowed. Lament is allowed. The dark night of the soul is allowed. The question why is allowed. The experience of God-forsakenness, which many of the deepest and most faithful believers in history have passed through, is not a sign of insufficient faith. It may paradoxically be a sign of the deepest kind, because it is the person who genuinely knows and genuinely trusts, who is most devastated by the silence, most honest about the darkness, most unable to perform a peace they do not feel. And Jesus met those people. Thomas, John the Baptist, the women at the tomb, the disciples on the road to Emmaus, still lost in grief even after having been told of the resurrection, with gentleness and with presence and with truth. He never told them to stop feeling what they felt. He came to them where they were. The church at its best creates communities in which there is room for grief, in which the person who is in the middle of profound and unresolved suffering is not left to navigate that suffering alone or in private, because the community does not know how to be with them there, in which lament is understood not as a failure of faith, but as one of faith's most honest expressions, in which, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is recognized not as a moment of failure from the cross, but as a permanent permission given by the Son of God himself to be honest about what it feels like when the darkness is real and the answers are not yet there. Closing reflection. 9 things. 9 areas of human life and experience where the testimony of the Gospels, read carefully and honestly, reveals a Jesus who was considerably more generous, more open, more expansive, and more deeply engaged with the full range of human life than the traditions built in his name have always been willing to acknowledge. The enjoyment of food and the pleasures of the table, the sharing of wine and the celebration it belongs to, the physical joy of dancing and the embodied expression of delight, the honest wrestling of doubt and the hard questions that genuine faith is sometimes required to carry, the genuine non-strategic, non-instrumental friendship with people outside the community of faith, the lightness of laughter and the joy that overflows because life with God is genuinely abundantly good. The creative work and the making of beautiful things and the imagination that is itself a gift of the Creator. The freedom to rest without justifying it, to stop without performing productivity, to simply be rather than always do. And the honest, unmanaged, publicly expressed grief and lament that suffering requires and that Jesus modeled from Gethsemane and from the cross. None of this is a license to abandon moral seriousness. None of it is a suggestion that the idea of Christian ethics, of genuine transformation, of lives shaped by the character and the calling of Jesus, is itself a human construction to be set aside in the name of freedom. Jesus was the most morally serious person who has ever lived. His ethic was, in crucial respects, considerably more demanding than the rules-based religion of his day, not less, because he was not interested in the external compliance that leaves the heart untouched. He was interested in the transformation of the innermost person, in the kind of love that does not calculate what it can safely withhold, in the kind of integrity that goes all the way down, in the kind of faithfulness that holds in every context and every relationship, not just the ones where someone is watching. But the moral seriousness of Jesus was never arbitrary. It was never about building walls for the sake of walls, enforcing cultural conformity for the sake of belonging, producing guilt about aspects of human life that God himself wove into the fabric of creation and called good. Every genuine demand in the teaching of Jesus flows from love. Love for God, love for neighbor, love for the self as someone made in the image of God and therefore worth caring for well. And the fruit of the life he calls us into is not smallness and shame, and the persistent sensation that you are never quite measuring up to an ever-growing list of expectations. The fruit is freedom. The fruit is flourishing. The fruit is the abundant life that he described as the reason he came. When the church restricts what Jesus did not restrict, the people who bear the heaviest cost are often the most sincere. The artist told that their craft is worldly. The grief-stricken told that their sorrow suggests insufficient trust. The curious told that their questions are a threat to community. The person who laughs freely told that their lightness is unspiritual. The one who feasts with joy told to feel guilty about it. These are not people resisting the gospel. These are people being turned away from a religion of human additions and told it is the same thing as the way of Jesus. They are carrying weight he never asked them to carry, and it is heavy. He said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." An easy yoke, a light burden. Not no yoke. He was not describing a life of undisciplined self-indulgence in which nothing is asked of you and everything is permitted, but a yoke that fits. A burden that corresponds to the actual shape of the human being carrying it. A set of demands that flow from love and lead to life, rather than a stack of accumulated expectations that flow from anxiety and lead to exhaustion. The difference between those two things is not subtle, and it is not abstract. You can feel it in your body. You can feel it in the quality of your faith, whether it is expansive and alive and genuinely oriented toward the person of Jesus, or whether it is anxious and small and primarily occupied with managing the distance between what you feel and what you are supposed to feel. The question this conversation leaves you with is a personal one, and I want to give it to you gently and honestly, without pressure, as a gift for the days ahead. Take it with you, sit with it, bring it to God in prayer. Bring it to the Gospels with fresh eyes and an open heart. Where in your own experience of faith have you been carrying weight that Jesus never asked you to carry? Where have the walls of religious tradition created distances that Jesus spent his entire ministry trying to close? What aspects of your full humanity, your creativity, your grief, your laughter, your physical joy, your honest questions, your desire to rest, your love of a good meal, your friendships that cross every line the religious culture around you has drawn, have been put under suspicion by a tradition that traced those suspicions back to Jesus, but that cannot, when you look carefully, find them in his actual words or his actual life. You do not have to answer those questions today. You do not have to resolve them before Sunday, but do not forget them. Because the one who asked them, the one who ate with sinners and made wine at weddings and wept at graves and welcomed children and made room for doubters and put dancing in the Father's house and told stories that still make people laugh and weep and rethink everything. He is still inviting you into something. He always was. And the something he is inviting you into is bigger and freer and more beautiful and more demanding and more genuinely alive than any version of it that requires you to leave half of yourself outside. He said he came to give you life, abundant life, overflowing life, life with more than enough. Believe him. If something in this video moved you today, if a word landed, if a question opened up, if something you have been carrying for a long time finally found language, please do not keep that to yourself. Share this video. Send it to someone you love who is quietly struggling with the gap between the Jesus of the Gospels and the religion that has sometimes been built in his name. Send it to the person in your life who has drifted from faith, not because they stopped believing in Jesus, but because the version of faith they were handed felt too small, too heavy, too distant from the grace and the freedom and the genuine human warmth that comes through so clearly in the Gospels. Send it to the friend who is in the middle of grief and has been told in 100 subtle ways to keep it together. Share it wherever you share things. You never know what it might do. You never know who might watch it in the right moment and feel, for the first time in a long time, that there is room for them. Please subscribe to this channel if you have not already, and turn on the notifications so you do not miss what is coming, because we are only getting started. The upcoming content on this channel is going to keep going deeper into exactly this territory, the real Jesus, the actual Gospels, the honest questions, the places where faith becomes personal and searching and genuinely life-changing, rather than just a set of inherited assumptions. You do not want to miss what is ahead. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and come back. If this video blessed you, encouraged you, challenged you, or gave you something worth carrying into your week, give it a like. It takes 1 second, and it matters more than you know. It helps this channel reach more people who are asking these same questions, looking for this same kind of honest and grace-filled and Jesus-centered conversation. And to every single person who has watched this video to the very end, wherever in the world you are, whatever you are carrying today, whatever brought you here, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. It is the highest honor to be part of your journey, even in this small and digital way. You are loved, you are seen, you are wanted by God, in his community, at his table. The God who made you is bigger than the rules built in his name. The Jesus of the Gospels is freer than the religion that sometimes claims to represent him, and the life he came to give you is more abundant, more joyful, more fully human, and more genuinely sacred than you may have been told. Go in peace. Go in grace. Go with open hands and an open heart, and keep going deeper. God bless you.